Part 2 of Carl Junger's The Perfect Storm. After Marianne leaves the Green Tavern, Chris and Bobby finish up their drinks, and then tell Bugsy they're going out for a while. They step of the bathroom darkness, into the soft gray light of Gloucester in the rain, and walk across the street to Bill's. Bobby orders a couple of Budweisers while Chris fishes a dime out of her pocket, and calls her friend Thea from a payphone. She and Thea used to be neighbors in a housing project, and Chris thinks she might be able to borrow Thea's apartment for a while to give Bobby a proper goodbye. She wants to be alone with him for a while, and she wants to help Bugsy out if she can. It's possible Thea might be interested in him. He's leaving in a few hours for the Grand Banks, but you never know. Thea says come by any time, and Chris hangs up and goes back to the bar. Bobby's hangover has alchemized into a huge empty hunger, and they finish off their beers and leave a buck on the bar top and head back outside. They drive across town to a lunch place called Sammy J's and order 2 more beers and fish cakes and beans. Fish cakes are Bobby's favorite food, and he probably won't see them again until he's back on shore. The last thing fishermen want to eat out at sea is more fish. They eat fast and pack up Bugsy, and then drive over to Ethel's. Chris has had a falling out with Ethel's boyfriend, and Chris is going to move out everything she has stored there. It's still raining a little. Everything seems dark and oppressive, and they carry boxes of her belongings down one flight of stairs and pack it into the Volvo. They fill the car with lamps and clothes and houseplants, and then squeeze themselves in and drive across town to the projects on Arthur Street. Thea doesn't go for Bugsy, as it turns out. She's already got a boyfriend. The 4 of them sit around talking and drinking beer for a while, and then the men have a terrible realization. They've forgotten the hot dogs. Murph, who is charged with buying food for the trip, won't get hot dogs on his own. So if they want any, they'll have to get them on their own. They drive to Cape Ann Market, and Bobby and Bugsy run into the store and come back a few moments later with $50 worth of hot dogs. It's mid-afternoon now. It's getting close. Chris drives them back down Roger Street, past Walgreens and Americold and Gorton's, and turns down into the gravel lot behind Rose's Marine. Bobby and Bugsy get out with their hot dogs and jump from the pier to the deck of the Andrea Gale. Watching the men move around the boat, Chris thinks, this winter Bobby'll be down in Bradenton. Next summer he'll be back up here, but he's gone a month at a time, and that's just how it is. Bobby's a sword fisherman and owes a lot of money. At least they have a plan, though. Bobby signed a statement directing Bobby Brown to give his settlement check from the last trip to Chris, and she's going to use the money, almost $3,000, to pay off some of his debts and get an apartment in Lanesville, on the north shore of Cape Ann. Maybe living out there, they'll spend a little less time at the nest. And she's got 2 jobs lined up, one at the old farm inn in Rockport, and another taking care of the retarded son of a friend. They'll get by. Bobby might be away a lot, but they'll get by. Suddenly, there are shouts coming from the boat. Bugsy and Bobby are standing toe-to-toe on the wharf in the rain, wrenching a jug of bleach back and forth. Fists are coming up, and the bleach is going first one way and then another, and at any moment, it looks like one of them is going to roundhouse the other. It doesn't happen. Bobby finally turns away, spitting swears, and goes back to work. Out of the corner of her eye, Chris sees another fisherman named Sully angling across the gravel lot toward her car. He walks up and leans in the window. I just got a sight in the boat, he says. I'm replacing some guy who backed out. He looks over at Bobby and Bugsy. Can you believe this shit? 30 days together and it's starting already. The Andrea Gale in the language is a raked stem, hard-chinned western rig sword fisherman. That means her bow has a lot of angle to it. She has a nearly square cross-section, and her pilot house is up front rather than in the stern. Atop an elevated deck called the whaleback, she's 72 feet long, has a hull of continuously welded steel plate, and was built in Panama City, Florida in 1978. She has a 365 horsepower turbocharged diesel engine, which is capable of speeds up to 12 knots. There are 7 Type 1 life preservers on board, 6 Imperial Survivor suits, a 406 megahertz emergency position indicating radio beacon, EPIRB, a 121.5 megahertz EPIRB, and a Givens auto-inflating life raft. There are 40 miles of 700-pound test monofilament line on her thousands of hooks, and room for 5 tons of bait fish. An ice machine that can make 3 tons of ice a day sits on her whale back deck, and a state-of-the-art electronics fill her pilot house, radar, LORAN, single sideband, VHF, weather track satellite receiver. There's a washer-dryer on board, and the galley has fake wood veneer and a 4-burner stove. The Andrea Gale is one of the biggest moneymakers in Gloucester Harbor, and Billy Tyne and Bugsy Moran have driven all the way from Florida to grab sites on board. The only other sword boat in the harbor that might be able to outfish her is the Hannah Bowden, skippered by a Colby College graduate named Linda Greenlaw. Not only is Greenlaw one of the only women in the business, she's one of the best captains, period, on the entire East Coast. Year after year, trip after trip, she makes more money than almost anyone else. Both the Andrea Gale and the Hannah Bowden are owned by Bobby Brown, and they can take so much fish from the ocean that Ethel's son Ricky has been known to call in from Hawaii to find out if either one is in port. When the Hannah Bowden unloads her catch in Gloucester, swordfish prices plummet halfway across the world. So far, though, Billy's second trip on the Andrea Gale is off to a bad start. The boys have been drinking hard all week, and everyone's in a foul mood. No one wants to go back out. For the past several days, almost every attempt to work on the boat has degenerated either into a fight or an occasion to walk across the street to the bar. Now it's September 20th, late in the season to be heading out, and Tyne can barely round up a full crew. Alfred Pierre, an immense, kind Jamaican from New York City, is holed up with his girlfriend in one of the upstairs rooms at the Nest. One minute he says he's going, the next minute he's not. It's been like that all day long. Bobby's somewhere across town with a black eye and a hangover. Bugsy's in an ugly mood because he hasn't met a woman. Murph is complaining about money and misses his kid. And the last straw, a new crew member, walked off this morning without any explanation at all. The guy's name was Adam Randall, and he was supposed to replace Doug Costco, who'd crewed up on a previous trip. Randall had driven up from East Bridgewater, Massachusetts, with his father-in-law that morning to take the job. He pulled into the dirt parking lot behind Rose's and got out to look the boat over. Randall was a lithe, intensely handsome 30-year-old man with a shag of blonde rock star hair and cold blue eyes. He was a welder, an engineer, a scuba diver, and had fished his whole life. He knew an unsafe boat when he saw one. He called them slabs, and the Andrea Gale was anything but. She looked like she could take an aircraft carrier broadside. Moreover, he knew most of her crew, and his girlfriend had practically told him not to bother coming home if he didn't take the job. He hadn't worked in 3 months. He walked back across the lot, told his father-in-law that he had a funny feeling. The two of them drove off together to a bar. People often get premonitions when they do jobs that could get them killed, and in commercial fishing, still one of the most dangerous pursuits in the country, people get premonitions all the time. The trick is knowing when to listen to them. In 1871, a cook named James Nelson shipped aboard the schooner Sachem for a fishing trip to George's Bank. One night, he was awakened by a recurring dream and ran aft to tell the captain. "For God's sake, get clear of the banks," he begged. "I've had my dream again. I've been shipwrecked twice after this dream." The captain was an old salt named Wenzel. He asked what the dream was. "I see women, dressed in white, standing in the rain," Nelson replied. There was hardly a breath of wind, and Wenzel was not impressed. He told Nelson to go back to bed. A while later, a little breeze sprang up. Within an hour, it was blowing hard, and the Sachem was hove to under close-reefed foresail. The hull started to open up and the crew manned the pumps. They couldn't keep up with the leak, and Wenzel desperately signaled to a nearby Gloucester schooner, the Pescador. The Pescador put dories over the side and managed to save the Sacom's crew. Within half an hour, the Sacom rolled over, settled bow down into the sea, and sank. Even today, instincts are heeded and fears are listened to. Randall walked off, and suddenly Tyne had another sight to fill. He called around and finally got 28-year-old David Sullivan. Sully, as he's known, was mildly famous in town for having saved his entire crew one frigid January night. His boat, the Harmony, was tied to another boat when she began to take water out at sea. Her crew started screaming for help, but couldn't wake up the men on the other boat, so Sully jumped overboard and pulled himself across on a rope, legs dragging through the icy North Atlantic. Sullivan, in other words, was a good man to have on board. Tyne said he'd been over to pick him up in half an hour. Sully packed a bag and made few phone calls to tell people he'd be away for a while. Suddenly, his plans for that evening were off. His life was on hold for the next month. Billy showed up around 2 o'clock, and they drove back to Rose's just in time to see Bobby and Bugsy going at it. Wonderful, Sully thought. He stopped to say hello to Chris, and then Billy sent him off to the Cape Ann market to get food for the trip. Murph went with him. Bulging in Sully's pocket was $4,000 in cash. One of the things about commercial fishing is that everything seems to be extreme. Fishermen don't work in any normal sense of the word. They're at sea for a month and then home celebrating for a week straight. They don't earn the same kind of money most people do. They come home either busted or with $250,000 worth of fish in their hold. And when they buy food for the month, it's not something any normal person would recognize as shopping. It's a retail catastrophe of biblical proportions. Murph and Sully drive to Cape Ann Market out on Route 127 and begin stalking up and down the aisles, throwing food in their carts by the armful. They grab 50 loaves of bread, enough to fill 2 carts. They take 100 pounds of potatoes, 30 pounds of onions, 25 gallons of milk, $80 racks of steak. Every time they fill a cart, they push it to the back of the store and get another one. The herd of carts started to grow. 10, 15, 20 carts, and people were people stare nervously and get out of the way. Murph and Sully grab anything they want and lots of it. Ice cream sandwiches, Hostess cupcakes, bacon and eggs, creamy peanut butter, porterhouse steaks, chocolate-coated cereal, spaghetti, lasagna, frozen pizza. They get top-of-the-line food, and the only thing they don't get is fish. Finally, they get 30 cartons of cigarettes, enough to fill a whole cart, and round their carts up like so many stainless steel cattle. The store opens 2 cash registers especially for them, and it takes half an hour to ring them through. The total nearly cleans Sully out. He pays while Murph backs the truck up to a loading dock, and they have the food on and then drive down to Rose's Wharf. Bag by bag, they carry out $4,000 worth of groceries down into the fish hold of the Andrea Gale. The Andrea Gale has a small refrigerator in the galley and 20 tons of ice in the hold. The ice keeps the bait fish and groceries from spoiling on the way out and the swordfish from spoiling on the way home. In a pinch, it can even be used to keep dead crew member fresh. Once a desperately alcoholic old fisherman died on the Hannah Bowden, and Linda Greenlaw had to put him down the hole because the Coast Guard refused to fly him out. Commercial fishing simply wouldn't be possible without ice. Without diesel engines, maybe. Without Loran, weather faxes, or hydraulic winches, but not without ice. There is simply no other way to get fish to market. In the old days, Grand Banks fishermen used to run to Newfoundland to salt dry their catch before heading home, but the coming of the railroads in the 1840s changed all that. Suddenly, food could be moved faster than it would spoil, and ice companies sprang up practically overnight to accommodate the new market. They cut ice from ponds in the winter, packed it in sawdust, and then sold it to schooners in the summer months. Properly packed ice lasted so long and was so valuable that traders could ship it to India and still make a profit. The market for fresh fish changed fishing forever. No longer could schooner captains return home at their leisure with a hold full of salt cod. Now it was all one big race. Several full schooners pulling into port at once could saturate the market and ruin the efforts of anyone following. In the 1890s, one schooner had to dump 200 tons of halibut into Gloucester Harbor because she'd been beaten into port by 6 other vessels. Overloaded schooners built like racing sloops dashed home through fall gales with every inch of canvas showing, and their decks practically awash. Bad weather sank these elegant craft by the dozen, but a lot of people made a lot of money. And in cities like Boston and New York, people were suddenly eating fresh Atlantic cod. Little has changed. Fishing boats still make the same mad dashes for the shore they were making 150 years ago. And the smaller boats, the ones that don't have ice machines, are still buying it in bulk from Cape Pond Ice, located in a low brick building between Felicia Oil and Parisi Seafoods. In the old days, Cape Pond used to hire men to carve up a local pond with huge ice saws, but now the ice is made in row upon row of 350-pound blocks called cans. The cans look like huge versions of the trays in people's refrigerators. They're extracted from freezers in the floor, skidded onto elevators, hoisted to the third floor, and dragged down a runway by men wielding huge steel hooks. The men work in a building the size refrigerator and wear shirts that say Cape Pond Ice, the coolest guys around. The ice blocks are shoved down a chute into a steel cutting drum, where they jump and rattle in terrible spasms until all 350 pounds have been eaten down into little chips and sprayed through a hose into the hold of a commercial boat outside. Cape Pond is one of hundreds of businesses jammed into the Gloucester waterfront. Boats come into port, offload their catch, and then spend the next week making repairs and gearing up for the next trip. A good-sized wave can bury a sword boat underwater for a few seconds. It just gets real dark in here, is how Linda Greenlaw describes the experience, and undoing the effects of a drubbing like that can take days, even weeks. One boat came into port twisted. Most boats are repaired at Gloucester Marine Railways, a haul-out place that's been in business since 1856. It consists of a massive wooden frame that rides steel coast rollers along 2 lengths of railroad track up out of the water. 600-ton boats are blocked up, lashed down, and hauled ashore by a double shot of 1-inch chain worked off a series of huge steel reduction gears. The gears were machined 100 years ago and haven't been touched since. There are 3 railways in all, 1 in the inner harbor and 2 out on Rocky Neck. The harbor railway is the least robust of the 3 and terminates in a greasy little basement, which sports a pair of strangely Moorish-looking brick arches. The other 2 railways are surrounded by the famous galleries and piano bars of Rocky Neck. Tourists blithely wander past machinery that could rip their summer homes right off their foundations. The Andrea Gale had been touched up by the railways, but most of her major work was done in St. Augustine, Florida, in 1987. Almost 3 feet were added to her stern to accommodate 2 1,900-gallon fuel tanks. The whaleback deck was extended aft 9 feet, and a steel bulwark on the port side was raised and extended 18 feet. In addition, 28 fuel oil drums, 7 water drums, and the ice machine were stored on the whaleback. In all, perhaps about 10 tons of steel, fuel, and machinery were added to the whaleback. The weight had been added high up, 8 feet or so above the deck, and perhaps twice that high above the waterline. The boat's center of gravity had been changed just a little. The Andrea Gale would now sit more deeply in the water, recover from rolls a bit more slowly. On the other hand, she could now put to sea 4 to 6 weeks at a time. That, after all, was the point, and no man on the boat would have disagreed. God's country. Going to sea is going to prison, with a chance at drowning besides. Samuel Johnson. By mid-afternoon, the Andrea Gale is ready. The food and bait have been stowed away. The fuel and water tanks have been topped off. Spare drums of both have been lashed onto the whaleback, and the gears in good order, and the engines running well. All that remains to do is leave. Bobby climbs off the boat without saying anything to Bugsy. They're still morose after their fight, and walks across the parking lot to Chris's Volvo. They drive back across town to Thea's and trot up her front steps in a soft, warm rain. Thea hears their feet on the stoop and invites them in and takes her cue from a quick glance from Chris. "I've got some errands to do. I'll be back in a few hours," she says. "Make yourself at home." Chris and Bobby tug each other into the dark bedroom and lie down on the bed. Outside, the rain taps on. Chris and Bobby can't see the ocean, but they can smell it. A dank taste of salt and seaweed that permeates the entire peninsula and lays claim to it as part of the sea. On rainy days, there's no getting away from it. Wherever you go, you breathe in that smell, and this is one of those days. Chris and Bobby lie together in Thea's bed, talking and smoking and trying to forget the fact that this is his last day. And after an hour, the phone rings and Bobby jumps up to answer it. It's Sully on the line, calling from the crow's nest. "It's 5 o'clock, Sully says. Time to go." The mood is dark and grim when they get down to the nest. Alfred Pierre is still locked in an upstairs room with his girlfriend and won't come out. Billy Tynes just returned from a 2-hour phone conversation with his ex-wife, Jody. Murph's there with a pile of toys on the pool table, packing them into a cardboard box. Ethel in the back room crying. Bobby's money problems, the black eye, the month offshore. The Grand Banks in October is no joke, and everybody knows it. There won't be half a dozen boats out there from the whole East Coast fleet. Alfred Pierre finally comes down and sidles into the bar. He's a big, shy man who's not well known around town, although people seem to like him. His girlfriend has come down from Maine to see him off, and she's not handling it well. Her eyes are red, and she's holding him as if she might physically keep him from getting on the boat. Murph finishes strapping his package up with tape and asks Chris to run him across town on an errand. He wants to pick up some movies. Sully is talking to Bugsy in a corner, and everyone's congratulating Ethel's eldest son, Rusty, for his upcoming marriage next week. Most of the people in the room will be 1,000 miles into the North Atlantic by then. Chris and Murph return 10 minutes later with a cardboard box spilling with videos. There's a VCR on the Andrea Gale, and someone off another boat offered Murph the movies. Alfred has a beer bottle clenched in one big hand and is still muttering about not wanting to go. Sully's saying the same thing. He's in a yellow slicker over by the pool table, telling Bugsy how he's got a bad feeling about this trip. "It's the money," he says. "If I didn't need the money, I wouldn't go near this thing." "Okay, you guys," Billy says. "One last drink. Everyone downs one last drink." "Okay, one more," someone says. Everyone has one more. Bobby's drinking tequila. He's standing by Chris, looking down at the floor, and she's holding his hand, and neither of them are saying much. Sully comes over and asks if they're going to be okay. Chris says, "Sure, we'll be fine." And then she says, "Actually, I'm not sure. Actually, no, I don't think so. 6 men are leaving for a month, and it feels as if things are shearing off into a new and empty direction from which they may never return." Ethel, trying to maintain her composure, goes around the room hugging all the men. The only person she doesn't hug is Alfred, because she doesn't know him well enough. Bobby asks his mother if they can take the color TV above the bar. "If it's okay with Billy," she says. Billy looks up. "Ethel," he says, "they can take the TV, but if they watch it instead of doing their work, it's going straight overboard." "That's fine, Billy, that's fine," Ethel says. Billy's girlfriend sees Bobby's shiner under the brim of his Budweiser cap and glances over at Chris. She's off the old school where ladies don't slug their men. "You northern gal," she says. "I didn't mean it," says Chris. "It was a mistake." It's now way too late for anyone to back out. Not in the literal sense. Any one of them could still take off running out the door, but people don't work like that. More or less, they do what others expect them to do. If one of the crew backed out now, he'd sit around for a month, then either go to a welcome home party or a memorial service. Either would be horrible in its own way. Half the crew have misgivings about this trip, but they're going anyhow. They've crossed some invisible line. and now even the most desperate premonitions won't save them. Tyne, Pierre, Sullivan, Moran, Murphy, and Shatford are going to the Grand Banks on the Andrea Gale. Okay, Billy says, let's go. Everyone flies out the big wooden door. The rain has stopped, and there are even a few scraps of clear sky off to the west, pale late summer blue. Chris and Bobby get into her Volvo, and Alfred and his girlfriend get into their car, and everyone else walks. They cross Roger Street through the impatient stream of Friday afternoon traffic, and then angle down through the gate in the chain-link fence. There are fuel tanks on iron scaffolds behind roses, and small boats up with tarps over them, and battered sign that says Carter's Boatyard. One of the fuel tanks has a pair of humpback whales printed on it. Chris drives past the little group, tries crunching on the gravel, and comes to a stop in front of the Andrea Gale. The boat is tied up to a small piece of wharf behind Old Port Seafoods, next to the fire boat and a dockside fuel pump. Bobby looks over at her. I don't want to do this, he says. I really don't. Chris is holding on to him in the front seat of her Volvo, with everything she owns in the back. Well, don't go then, she says. Well, fuck it, don't go. I gotta go. The money. I got to. Billy Tyne walks over and leans in the window. You gonna be all right? He asks. Chris nods her head. Bobby is really starting to fight the tears, and he looks away so that Billy doesn't see. Okay, Billy says to Chris. We'll see you when we get back. He walks across the dock and jumps down the deck of the boat. Then Sully comes over. He's known Bobby most of his life. Without Bobby, he probably wouldn't even have taken the trip, and he's worried about him now. Worried that somehow Bobby isn't going to make it. That the trip's a huge mistake. Are you two okay, he says. Are you sure? Yeah, we're okay, says Chris. We just need a minute. Sully smiles and slaps the car roof and walks away. Bugsy and Murph don't have to have anyone to linger over, and so they waste no time getting on the boat. Now it's just two couples in their cars. Alfred detaches himself from his girlfriend in the front seat and gets out and walks across the dock. His girlfriend looks around crying and spots Chris in the Volvo. She draws 2 fingers down her cheeks. Yes, I'm sad too. And then just sits there, tears running down her cheeks. There's nothing more to wait for now. Nothing more to say. Bobby's trying to keep it together because of the other 5 guys on the boat, but Chris is not trying to keep it together. Well, I gotta go now, he says. Yep. And Christina, you know, I'll always love you. She smiles at him through her tears. Yeah, I know, she says. Bobby kisses her and gets out of the car, still holding hands. He closes the door and gives her a final smile, and then starts walking across the gravel. As Chris remembers it, he doesn't look back, not once, and he keeps his face hidden the entire way. Almost as soon as the New World was discovered, Europeans were fishing it. 12 years after Columbus, a Frenchman named Jean Denis crossed the Atlantic, worked the Grand Banks off Newfoundland, and returned home with a hole full of cod. Within a few years were so many Portuguese boats on the banks of their king felt compelled to compose an import tax in order to protect the fishermen at home. Codfish ran so thick off Newfoundland, it was said that they slowed ships down in the water. Codfish weren't that plentiful, but they were certainly worthy of crossing the Atlantic for, and they were easily transported. Crews salted them aboard ship, dried them when they got home, then sold them by the hundreds of thousands. The alternative was to go over with 2 crews, one to fish, and the other to preserve the catch on shore. The fish were split down the middle, then laid on racks called flakes, to cure all summer in the Newfoundland air. Either way, the result was a rugged slab of protein that could be treated as indelicately as shoe leather, and then soaked back to a palatable platform. Soon European ships were shuttling back and forth across the North Atlantic in a hugely lucrative, if perilous, trade. For the first 50 years, the European powers were content to fish off Newfoundland and leave the coastlines alone. They were jagged, gloomy places that seemed to offer little more than a chance to impale one's ship. Then, in 1598, a French marquis named Troilus de Mesguz pulled 60 convicts from French prisons and deposited them on a barren strip of sand called Sable Island, south of Nova Scotia. Left to shift for themselves, the men hunted wild cattle, constructed huts from shipwrecked vessels, rendered fish oil, and gradually killed one another off. By 1603, there were only 11 left alive, and these unfortunates were dragged back to France and presented to King Henry VI. They were clothed in animal skins and had beards halfway down their chests. Not only did the king pardon them in their crimes, he gave them a bounty to make up for their suffering. It was around this time that Cape Ann was first sighted by Europeans. In 1605, the great French explorer Samuel de Champlain was working his way south from Casco Bay, Maine, when he rounded the rock ledges of Thatcher's Milk and Salt Islands and cast anchor off a sandy beach. The natives drew for him a map off the coastline to the south, and Champlain went on to explore the rest of New England, before returning to Cape Ann the following year. This time, he was clawing his way up the coastline in some ugly fall weather when he sought shelter in a natural harbor he'd missed on his previous trip. He was greeted by a party of Abenaki Indians, some of whom wore the scraps of Portuguese clothing they had traded for 100 years before, and they made a great show of hospitality before launching a surprise attack from the woods of the eastern point. The Frenchmen easily fended themselves off, and on the last day of September 1606, with the Indians waving goodbye from the shore, and the oaks and maples rusting into their fall colors, Champlain set sail again. Because of the sheltered coves and thick shellfish beds he called the place Beauport, the good harbor. 17 years later, a group of Englishmen sailed into Beauport, eyed the local abundance of cod, and cast their anchor. The year was 1623. The ship was financed by the Dorchester Company, a group of London investors that wanted to start tapping the riches of the New World. Their idea was to establish a settlement on Cape Ann and use it to support a fleet of boats that would fish all spring and summer and return to Europe in the fall. The shore crew was charged with building a habitable colony and drying the catch as it came in. Unfortunately, luck was against the Dorchester men from the start. The first summer they caught a tremendous amount of fish, but the bottom dropped out of the cod market, and they didn't even make expenses. The next year, prices returned to normal, but they caught almost no fish at all. And the third year, violent gales damaged the boats and drove them back to England. The company was forced to liquidate its assets and bring its men home. A few of the settlers refused to leave, though. They combined forces with a band of outcasts from the tyrannical Plymouth colony and formed the nucleus of a new colony at Gloucester. New England was an unforgiving land in those days, where only the desperate and devout seemed to survive, and Gloucester wound up with more than its share of the former. Its most notorious citizen was the Reverend John Lyford, whose deeds were so unchristian he criticized the church and groped a local servant girl. As to be deemed unprintable by a local historian, another was shipwrecked adventurer named Fells, who fled Plymouth to escape public whipping. His crime was that he had unsanctioned relations with a young woman. Gloucester was a perfect place for loose cannons like Lyford and Fells. It was poor, remote, and the Puritan fathers didn't particularly care what went on up there. After a brief period of desertion, the town was resettled in 1631, and almost immediately the inhabitants took to fishing. They had little choice, Cape Ann being on one big rock, but in some ways that was a blessing. Farmers are easy to control because they're tied to the land, but fishermen are not so easy to control. A 20-year-old off a 3-month trip to the Banks has precious little reason to heed the bourgeois mores of the town. Gloucester developed a reputation for tolerance, if not outright debauchery, that drew people from all over the Bay Colony. The town began to thrive. Other communities also had a healthy streak of godlessness in them, but it was generally relegated to the outskirts of town. Wellfleet, for example, reserved an island across the harbor for its young men. In due time, a brothel, a tavern, and a whale lookout were built there, just about everything a young fisherman needed. Gloucester had no such buffer, though. Everything happened right on the waterfront. Young women avoided certain streets. Town constables were on the lookout for errant fishermen, and orchard owners rigged guns to tripwires to protect their apple trees. Some Gloucester fishermen apparently didn't even respect the Sabbath. Cape Cod captains were wild-eyed in agony of inner conflict, recorded a Cape Cod historian named Joseph Berger, as they read the scriptures to their crews, while some godless Gloucester craft lay in plain sight, hauling up a full share of mackerel or cod. If the fishermen lived hard, it was no doubt because they died hard as well. In the industry's heyday, Gloucester was losing a couple of hundred men every year to the sea. 4% of the town's population since 1650, an estimated 10,000 Gloucestermen have died at sea, far more Gloucestermen than died in all the country's wars. Sometimes a storm would hit the Grand Banks, and half a dozen ships would go down, 100 men lost overnight. On more than one occasion, Newfoundlanders woke up to find their beaches strewn with bodies. The Grand Banks are so dangerous because they happen to sit on one of the worst storm tracks in the world. Low-pressure systems form over the Great Lakes, or Cape Hatteras, and follow the jet stream out to sea, crossing right over the fishing ground in the process. In the old days, there wasn't much the boats could do but put out an extra anchor cable and try to ride it out. As dangerous as the Grand Banks were, though, George's Bank, only 180 miles east of Cape Cod, was even worse. There was something so ominous about George's that fishing captains refused to go near it for 300 years. Currents ran in strange vortexes on George's, and the tide was said to run off so fast that the ocean bottom was left exposed for gulls to feed on. Men talked of strange dreams and visions they had there, and the uneasy feeling that dire forces were assembling themselves. Unfortunately, George's was also home to one of the greatest concentrations of marine life in the world, and it was only a matter of time before someone tried to fish it. In 1827, a Gloucester skipper named John Fletcher Wanson hove off to George's, threw out a fishing line, and pulled up a halibut. The ease with which the fish had been caught stuck in his mind, and 3 years later he went back to George's expressly to fish. Nothing particularly awful happened, and soon ships were going back and forth to George's without a second thought. It was only a one-day trip from Gloucester, and the superstitions about the place started to fade. That was when George's turned deadly. Because the fishing grounds were so small and close to shore, dozens of schooners might be anchored within a sight of each other on a fair day. If a storm came on gradually, the fleet had time to weigh anchor and disperse into deeper water. But a sudden storm could pile ship upon ship until they all went down in a mass of tangled spars and rigging. Men would be stationed at the bow of each boat to cut their anchor cables if another boat were bearing down on them. But that was usually a death sentence in itself. The chances of sailing clear off the shoal water were horribly small. One of the worst of these catastrophes happened in 1862, when a winter gale bore down on 70 schooners that were working a closely packed school of cod. Without warning, the sky turned black and the snow began to drive down almost horizontally. One fisherman described what ensued. My shipmates showed no sign of fear. They were now all on deck, and the skipper was keeping a sharp lookout. Somewhere about 9 o'clock, the skipper sang out, "There's a vessel adrift right ahead of us. Stand by with your hatchet, but don't cut until you hear the word." All eyes were bent now on the drifting craft. On she came, directly at us. A moment more, and the signal to cut must be given. With the swiftness of a gull, she passed by so near that I could have leapt aboard. The hopeless, terror-stricken faces of the crew we saw but a moment, as the doomed craft sped on her course. She struck one of the fleet a short distance astern, and we saw the waters close over both vessels almost instantly. A few modern sword-fishing boats still fish George's Bank, but most make the long trip to the Grand. They're out for longer, but come back with more fish. The old trade-off. It takes a week to reach the Grand Banks on a modern sword boat. You drive east-northeast around the clock until you're 1,200 miles out of Gloucester and 400 miles out of Newfoundland. From there, it's easier to get to Azores than back to the crow's nest. Like George's, the Grand Banks are shallow enough to allow sunlight to penetrate all the way to the bottom. An infusion of cold water called the Labrador Current crosses the shoals and creates the perfect environment for plankton. Small fish collect to feed on the plankton, and big fish collect to feed on the small fish. Soon the whole food chain's there, right up to the 70-foot sword boats. The trip in and out are basically the parts of the month that sword fishermen sleep. In port, they're too busy cramming as much as they can into 5 or 6 days, and on the fishing grounds, they're too busy working. They work 20 hours a day for 2 or 3 weeks straight and then fall into their bunks for the long steam back. The trips entail more than just eating and sleeping, though. Fishing gear, like deck gear, takes a terrific amount of abuse and must be repaired constantly. The crew doesn't want to waste a day fishing because their gear's messed up, so they tend to it on the way out. They sharpen hooks, tie gangions, tie ball drops, set up the leader cart, check the radio buoys at the Hague line, where they enter Canadian waters. They must stow the gear in accordance with international law and are briefly without anything to do. They sleep, talk, watch TV, and read. There are high school dropouts who go through half a dozen books on the Grand Banks. About 8 or 9 a night, the crew squeeze into the galley and shovel down whatever cook has put together. Murph is the cook on the Andrea Gale. He's paid extra and stands watch while the other men eat. At dinner, the crew talk about what men everywhere talk about: women, lack of women, kids, sports, horse racing, money, lack of money, work. They talk about work. They talk a lot about work. They talk about it the way that men in prison talk about time. Work is what's keeping them from going home, and they all want to go home. The more fish they catch, the sooner the trip's over, which is a simple equation that turns them all into amateur marine biologists. After dinner, someone takes his turn at the dishes, and Billy goes back up to the wheelhouse so Murph can eat. No one likes washing dishes, so guys sometimes trade the duty for a pack of cigarettes. The longer the trip, the cheaper the labor gets, until a $50,000 a year fisherman is washing dishes for a single smoke. Dinner at the end of such a trip might be a bowl of croutons with salad dressing. Everyone in the crew stands watch twice a day. The shifts are 2 hours long and involve little more than watching the radar and occasionally punching numbers into the autopilot. If the gear is out, the night watches might have to jog back onto the main line to keep from drifting too far away. The Andrea Gale has a padded chair in her wheelhouse, but it's set back from the helm so that no one can fall asleep on the watch. The radar and LORAN are bolted to the ceiling, along with the VHF and single sideband, and the video plotter and autopilot are on control panel to the left. There are 9 Lexan windows and a pistol grip spotlight that protrudes from the ceiling. The wheel is the size of a bicycle tire and positioned at the very center of the helm, about waist high. There's no reason to touch the wheel unless the boat has been taken off autopilot, and there's almost no reason to take the boat off autopilot. From time to time, the helmsman checks the engine room, but otherwise he just stares out at sea. Strangely, the sea doesn't get tedious to look at. Wave trains converge and crisscross in patterns that have never happened before and will never happen again. It can take hours to tear one's eyes away. Billy Tyne's been out to the Grand Banks dozens of times before, and he's also fished off the Carolinas, Florida, and deep into the Caribbean. He grew up on Gloucester Avenue, near where Route 128 crosses Annisquam River, and married a teenage girl who lived a few blocks away. Billy was exceptional for downtown Gloucester in that he didn't fish and his family was relatively well off. He ran a Mexican import business for a while, worked for a vault manufacturer, sold waterbeds. His older brother was killed at age 21 by a landmine in Vietnam, and perhaps Billy drew the conclusion that life was not something to be pissed away in a bar. He enrolled in school, set his sights on being a psychologist, and started counseling drug-addicted teenagers. He was searching for something, trying out different lives, but nothing seemed to fit. He dropped out of school and started working again. But by then he had a wife and 2 daughters to support. His wife Jody had been urging him to give fishing a try because she had a cousin whose husband made a lot of money at it. You never know, she told him. You might just like it. It was all over after that, says Jody. The men don't know anything else once they do it. They love it, and it takes over, and that's the bottom line. People get possessed with church or God, and fishing's just another thing they get possessed with. It's something inside of them that nobody can take away. And if they're not doing it, they're not going to be happy. It helped, of course, that Billy was good at it. He had an uncanny ability to find fish, a deep sense of where they were. It was weird. It was like he had radar, says Jody. He was one of a few guys who could go out and catch fish all the time. Everyone always wanted to fish with him, 'cause he always made money. Tyne's very first trip was on the Andrea Gale, and after that, he switched over to the Linnaeus Sea, owned by a man named Warren Cannon. Tyne and Cannon became close friends, and for 8 years, Cannon taught him everything he knew. After his long apprenticeship, Tyne decided to go out on his own, and he began to take out the that fucking Clorox bottle, as Charlie Reed called it. It was a fiberglass boat. By this time, Tyne was fully hooked. The strains of being at sea had split up his marriage, but he still wouldn't give up. He moved to Florida to be closer to his ex-wife and daughters, and fished harder than ever. Every summer, Tyne's 2 daughters, Erica and Billy Joe, went up to Gloucester to visit their grandparents, and Tyne would stop over between trips to see them. He also kept in touch with Charlie Reed, and when Reed stepped down from the Andrea Gale, Billy's name came up. Brown offered him a sight as skipper of the boat, and 1/3 of the crew's share. It was a good deal. A man like Tyne could clear $100,000 a year that way. He accepted. In the meantime, Reed got a job on a 90-foot steel dragger called the Corey Pride. He'd make less money, but he'd spend more time at home. I just couldn't get into the gypsy life anymore, Reed says. Moving around, not coming home home 3 months at a time. I got by, but it was hell on my wife, and I thought I'd made enough to keep all my kids in school. I hadn't, but I thought I had. The Andrea Gale rides out to the fishing grounds on the back of a high-pressure system that comes bulging out of Canada. The winds are out of the northwest, and skies are a deep, sharp blue. These are the prevailing winds for the area. They are the reason people say down east when they refer to the northeast Maine. Schooners that hauled eastward downwind could be in St. John's or Halifax within 24 hours. A 365 horsepower diesel engine makes the effect less pronounced, but heading out is still a shorter trip than heading in. By September 26th or 27th, Billy Tyne's around 42 north and 49 west, about 300 miles off the tip of Newfoundland, in a part of the Grand Banks known as the Tail, Canadian national waters, which extend 200 miles offshore, exclude foreign boats from most of the banks, but 2 small sections protrude to the northeast and southeast, the nose and the tail. Sword boats patrol an arc hinging on a spot around 50 degrees west and 44 degrees north. Inside that arc are the broad, fertile submarine plains of the Grand Banks, off limits to all but Canadian boats and licensed foreign boats. Outside that arc are thousands of legal swordfish that might conceivably be fooled by a mackerel hung on a big steel hook. Swordfish are not gentle animals. They swim through the schools of fish, slashing wildly with their swords, trying to eviscerate as many as possible. Then they feast. Swordfish have attacked boats, pulled fishermen to their deaths, slashed fishermen on deck. The scientific name for swordfish is Xiphias gladius. The first word means sword in Greek, and the second word means sword in Latin. The scientist who named it was evidently impressed by the fact that it had a sword, as one guidebook says. The sword, which is a bony extension of the upper jaw, is deadly sharp on the sides and can grow to a length of 4 or 5 feet. Backed by 500 pounds of sleek, muscular fish, the weapon can do quite a bit of damage. Swordfish have been known to drive their swords right through the hulls of boats. Usually, this doesn't happen unless the fish has been hooked or harpooned, but in the 19th century, a swordfish attacked a clipper ship for no apparent reason. The ship was so badly damaged that the owner applied to his insurer for compensation, and the whole affair wound up in court. Grand Banks swordfish spawn in the Caribbean and then edge northward during the summer months, heading for the cold, protein-rich waters off Newfoundland. During the daylight hours, the fish work their way down the water column to depths of 3,000 feet, chasing squid, hake, cod, butterfish, bluefish, mackerel, menhaden, and bonito, and at night they follow their prey back up to the surface. Their young hatch with scales and teeth, but no sword, and have been described as wistful-looking. Although all manner of fish feed on larval swordfish, only mako, sperm whale, and killer whale attack them while they're fully grown. Mature swordfish are considered to be one of the most dangerous game fish in the world, and have been known to fight non-stop for 3 or 4 hours. They have sunk small boats in their struggles. Sport fishermen need live bait on heavy steel hooks that are secured to 500-pound test steel, wire, or chain to catch swordfish. They also need a numbing club on board to beat the fish senseless. Commercial fishermen, who are in the business of avoiding the thrill of fishing, use different methods entirely. They hang 1,000 baited hooks on 40 miles of monofilament and then crawl into bed to get some sleep. Bob Brown doesn't know when Billy makes his first set because Billy hates talking to him on the radio. He's been known to leave messages with Linda Greenlaw in order not to talk to Bob Brown. He's been known to fake static on the sideband, but it's reasonable to assume that on the night of September 27th, Tynes making his first set of the trip, the boat's outriggers are boomed out and 2 steel plates known as birds hang by chain down in the water to provide stability. The ocean has already settled into the galloping darkness of mid-autumn, and the wind has swung around to the southeast. The surface of the ocean is cross-hatched with changing weather. Baiting has all the glamour of a factory shift and considerably more of the danger. The line is spooled on a big Lindgren drum that sits under the shelter of the whaleback on the port side of the boat. It crosses diagonally over the deck, passes through an overhead block, and then bends straight back toward the stern. A steel ring guides it over the rail and into the water. That's where the baiters stand. There's a bait table on top of the stern rail, basically a wooden well with squid and mackerel in it, and a leader cart on either side. The leader carts are small drums spooled with hundreds of lengths of 7-fathom line called gangions. Each gangion has a number 10 hook at one end and a stainless steel snap on the other. The baiter reaches behind him and takes a gangion from his backup man, who's peeling them off the leader cart one at a time. The baiter impales a squid or mackerel on the hook, snaps the gangion on the main line, and throws the whole thing over the side. The hook is easily big enough to pass through a man's hand, and if it catches some part of the baiter's body or clothing, he goes over the side with it. For this reason, baiters have complete control over the hook. No one handles the gangion while they're on it. There's also a knife holstered to the baiting table. A baiter might conceivably grab it fast enough to sever the line before going over. Since swordfish feed at night, each hook is also fixed with a xylem light stick that illuminates the bait. Xylems are cigar-sized plastic tubes with phosphorescent chemicals inside them that activate when the tube is snapped in half. They cost $1 a piece, and a sword boat might go through 5,000 in a trip. The hooks and light sticks are spaced about 30 feet apart, but the exact interval is determined by the speed of the boat. If the captain wants to fish the hooks closer together, he slows down. If he wants to spread them apart, he speeds up. The typical speed for setting out on the Grand Banks is 6 or 7 knots. At that speed, it takes about 4 hours to set out 30 miles of line. Every 3 hooks, the baiter snaps on a ball drop, which floats on the surface and keeps the long line from sinking to the bottom. A typical arrangement is to hang your line at 5 fathoms and dangle your hooks to 12. That's about 70 feet down. Depending on currents and the temperature breaks, that's where swordfish like to feed. Every 4 miles, instead of a ball drop, the baiter clips on a high flyer. The high flyer is afloat, an aluminum pole with a radar reflecting square on top. It bobs along on the surface of the ocean and shows up very clearly on the radar screen. Finally, every 8 miles, a radio transmitter is attached. It has a big whip antenna that broadcasts a low-frequency signal back to the boat. This allows the captain to track the gear down if it parts off mid-string. A fully baited long line represents a significant amount of money, and captains have been known to risk the lives of their crew to get them back. 40 miles of monofilament line goes for $1,800. Each of the radio beacon buoys costs $1,800, and there are 6 of them on a long line. The polyballs cost $6 apiece and are set every 3 hooks for 1,000 hooks. The hooks are $1, the light sticks are $1, the squid is $1, and the Gangians are $2. Every night, in other words, the sword boat drops $20,000 worth of gear into the North Atlantic. One of the biggest disputes on a sword boat, is whether to set out or not. Crews have hauled in a full gale because their captain misjudged the weather. The baiting usually gets finished up late in the evening, and the Andrea Gale crew hangs their rain gear in the tool room and tramps into the kitchen. They eat dinner quickly, and when they're done, Billy climbs up the companionway to take over the helm from Murph. He checks his Loran bearings, which fix him on the chart, and the video plotter, which fixes him in the relation to the main line. The radar is always on and has a range of 15 miles or so. The high flyers on the main line register as small squares on the screen. The VHF is turned to channel 16, and the single sideband is turned to 2182 MHz. They are both emergency channels, and if 2 boats need to communicate, they contact each other and switch to a separate working channel. At 11 p.m., the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, broadcasts a weather forecast, and the captains generally check in with each other afterward to discuss its finer points. By then, most of the crew has already turned in. They're into a stretch of 20-hour workdays, and sleep becomes coveted as cigarettes. The bunks are bolted against the tapered sides of the bow, and the men fall asleep listening to the diesel engine and the smack of waves against the hull. Underwater, the prop whine and the cavitation of hundreds of thousands of air bubbles radiate outward into the ocean. The sound wraps around the foreshores of Newfoundland, refracts off the discontinuity of the Gulf Stream, and dissipates into the cruising black depths beyond the continental shelf. Low-frequency vibrations propagate almost forever underwater, and the throb of the Andrea Gale's machinery must reach about every life form on the banks. Dawn at sea, a gray void emerging out of the vaster black one. The earth was without form, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. Whoever wrote that knew the sea, knew the pale emergence of the world every morning, a world that contained absolutely nothing, not one thing. A long blast on the air horn, the men stagger out of their bunks and pour themselves coffee under the fluorescent lights of the galley, squinting through swollen lids and bad moods. They can just start to make out shapes on deck when they go out. It's cold and raw, and under their slickers they have sweat shirts and flannel shirts and thermal tops. Dawn's not for another hour, but they start work as soon as they can see anything. At 43 degrees north, a week after the equinox, that's 5:30 in the morning, the boat is at the start of the main line, about 100 miles outside Canada's territorial limit. You generally set into the Gulf Stream and haul into the Gulf Stream so that the previous afternoon they'd set the gear while streaming west into the warm 4-knot current. They turned around and headed east again, back to the start of the main line. That gives the entire string the same amount of time in the water, and also keeps the boat from losing too much ground to the eastward currents. Billy has hunted down the beginning of the main line with the radio beacon signals and now sits bow toward America, ready to haul. Haulback is less dangerous than setting out because the hooks are coming back are coming inboard rather than going outboard, but the main line still gets pulled at considerable velocity out of the water. The hooks can whiplash over the rail and snag people in all kinds of horrible ways. One crewman took a hook in the face that entered under his cheekbone and came out his eye socket. To make matters worse, the boat is rarely a stable platform, rarely dry. Keeping one's feet while 18 inches of deck slop pour out the scuppers can require the balance of an iron worker in a sleet storm. Nevertheless, you're hauling up your lottery ticket, and even the most jaded deckhands want to know what he's hit. The line has been unhooked from the stern guide ring and now comes on board through a cutout in the starboard rail and into the overhead block. The captain steers the boat from the auxiliary helm on deck and runs up to the wheelhouse. From time to time, to check the radar for other boats in their path. The man at the line is called the hauler, and it's his job to unclip the gangions and hand them back to the coiler, who pulls the bait off and wraps them around the leader cart. Being a hauler is a high-stress job. One hauler described having to pry his fingers off the hydraulic lever at the end of the day because he was so tense. Haulers are paid extra for the trip and are chosen because they can unclip a gangion every few seconds for 4 hours straight. A hooked swordfish puts a telltale heaviness in the line, and when the hauler feels that, he eases off the hydraulic lever to keep the hook from tearing out. As soon as the fish is within reach, two men swing gaff hooks into the side and drag him on board. If the fish is alive, one of the gaffers might harpoon him and haul him up on a stouter line to make sure he doesn't get away. Then the fish just lays there, eyes bulging, mouth working open and shut. If it's a good haul, there are sometimes 3 or 4 half-dead swordfish sloshing back and forth in the deck wash, bumping into the men as they work. A puncture wound by swordfish bill means a severe and nearly instantaneous infection. As the fish are brought on board, their heads and tails are sawn off, and they're gutted and put on ice in the hold. Mako shark eat pretty much what swordfish do, so occasionally longliners haul mako up as well. They're dangerous, though. A mako once bit Murph so badly that he had to be helicoptered back to shore. Touching even a severed mako head can trigger it to bite. The rule for mako is that they're not considered safe until they're on ice in the hold. For that reason, some boats don't allow live mako on board. If one is caught, the gaffer pins him against the hull while another crew member blows his head wide open with a shotgun. Then he's hauled on board and gutted. We fished far out to take any chances, says a former crew member of the Hannah Boden. You're out of helicopter range, and help is 2 days' drive to the westward. If you're still alive when we get there, we'll take you to Newfoundland Hospital, and then your troubles have just begun. A longliner might pull up 10 or 20 swordfish on a good day, 1 ton of meat. The most Bob Brown has ever heard of anyone catching was 5 tons a day for 7 days. 70,000 pounds of fish. That was on the Hannah Boden in the mid-'80s. The lowest crew member made $10,000. That's why people fish. That's why they spend 10 months a year inside 70 feet of steel plate. For every trip like that, though, there's a dozen busts. Fish are not distributed equally throughout the water column. They congregate in certain areas. You have to know where those areas are. You generally set westward into the current. With a thermocline scope, you get temperature readings at different depths. With a Doppler, you get the velocity and direction of subsurface currents at 3 different levels. You want to set in fast water because the gear covers more area. You might anchor one end of the gear in cold water, which moves more slowly because you know where to find it. You want to hang the bait between layers of warm and cold water because the food chain tends to collect there. Squid feed on cold water plankton, and swordfish dart out of pockets of warm Gulf Stream water to feed on the squid. Warm water eddies that spin off the Gulf Stream into North Atlantic are particularly good places to fish. Captains track them down with daily surface temperature maps from NOAA weather satellites Finally, you want to avoid the dark of the moon when you plan your trips. No one knows why, but for several days before and after, the fish refuse to feed. Sword boat captains are required by law to keep records of every position fished, every set made, every fish caught. Not only does this help determine whether the boat is adhering to federal regulations, but it allows marine biologists to assess the health of the swordfish stock. Migratory patterns, demographic shifts, mortality rates, it can be inferred from catch logs. In addition, observers for the National Marine Fisheries Service occasionally accompany boats offshore to get better understanding of the industry they're charged with regulating. On August 18, 1982, the principal planner for the Massachusetts Coastal Zone Management Program, Joseph Pelzarski, left on such a trip. He steamed out of New Bedford aboard the Tiffany Vance, a California longanier that was going to try gill netting off Georgia's bank. The gill net was new to the East Coast, and Pelzarski wanted to see how it worked. Spotter planes, as it turned out, reported almost no swordfish on Georges, but infrared satellite imagery revealed an enormous warm water eddy at the tail of the banks. Alex Bueno, the ship's captain, decided to try longing up north, and Pelzarski went with them. Pelzarski's account had almost no impact on gill net regulations. They made just one set and caught just one fish, but it gave government biologists and statisticians one of their few glimpses of life on a longanier. The FV Tiffany Vance arrived in Shelburne, Nova Scotia at the first light on August 21st. We left that afternoon at 5:30 p.m., with fuel and supplies, and were escorted out of the harbor by dolphins riding the bow wake. 2 Spanish fishing vessels, a crewman on the Tiffany Vance was from Spain, were sighted heading west. Numerous container vessels were seen heading toward Canada. We arrived on the tail of the banks on August 25th. The water temperature was constantly monitored for edges where cold and warm water meet. On August 26th, the captain found good water as well as an open area among the other swordfish longaniers, and we were set that evening. The set took out an hour and a half, and 500 hooks were used. Haulback began at 5:10 a.m., with a pulling on board of the high flyer and radio beacon. Yankee hooks and traps were coiled and boxed as they came on board, and monofilament hooks were wound on reels, the captain steering and throttling the boat fishes, the long line for weight. The first fish was a swordfish, with its bill breaking the water surface, then rolling on its back dead. It was hauled to the vessel on the long line. Gaffed, it is pulled aboard, its sword sawed off, and the fish is cleaned. The crew checks the stomach contents and feels the internal body temperature for clues as to what type of water the fish has been in. Most of the swordfish were feeding on squid. The next 2 days of fishing took place in the same general area, south of the tail of the banks. On the second day, we caught 11 swordfish, 4 blue sharks, 1 mako shark, 1 sea turtle, released alive, and 1 skate. We kept the mako in addition to the swordfish. The third day, during set-out, we had a gear conflict. Despite efforts by captains to establish berths and to contact all area boats on gear positions, we crossed a long line. Our vessel stabilized, which hang from outriggers about 18 feet below surface, caught on a long line. The port stabilizer held fast, but the starboard stabilizer, which is composed of lead and steel, left the water and slammed into the bait box just inches from a seaman. To escape gear conflicts and the increased traffic, we moved northeast over the Newfoundland seamounts. The next fishing day, August 30th through 31st, was fairly routine. The captain set out a less number of hooks, 300, because the water wasn't quite right, flat water. Despite this, we caught 9 swordfish. During haulback, we lost the gear for an hour due to the main line parting. After haulback, the captain, in order to find better waters, steamed all night and into the northeast, approximately 170 miles, toward the Flemish Cap. Whales were seen in the distance. On September 4th, we set out 400 hooks, and the catch consisted of 12 swordfish, 1 mako shark, 3 lancetfish, 3 skates, 1 blue shark, and a leatherback turtle which was released alive. On the night of September 5th, the captain rendezvoused with a swordfish vessel, Andrea Gale, so I could get home. The vessels tied stern to stern, and transferred my gear on a second line. Then the vessels united, and the Andrea Gale aligned her starboard side to the stern of the Tiffany Vance, and I swam the 30 yards to the Andrea Gale. They pulled me on board, and 2 days later we landed at the port of Burin, Newfoundland. The owner of the Andrea Gale, Robert Brown, who flew to Newfoundland to replace malfunctioning generators, flew us home to Beverly Airport on September 9th, 1982. The Tiffany Vance arrived in New Bedford on October 18th, 63 days at sea, with 25,000 pounds of swordfish. Swordfish fishermen, in particular the Grand Banks fishermen, are at sea for extended periods of time without communication with the mainland. An opportunity to study short-term culture shock is available among these fishermen, and should be undertaken. Through the end of September and the first week in October, the crew of the Andrea Gale set out their gear, steam back, haul it up, and set it out again. The days are hot, and the men are in t-shirts on deck, their skin curing to a salt-streaked brown in the afternoon sun. In the evening, they put on jackets and sweatshirts and work the bait table with their hoods pulled up. The light angles and reddens and finally sinks into darkness with the deck lights, running the stars and the sharp, cold air digging at memories of the New England fall. Around 10 o'clock, the men finish up and pitch into their bunks for a few hours of sleep. To a fisherman, the Grand Banks are distinct recognizable as, say, the Arizona desert or the swamps of Georgia. They have their own particular water, light, white wildlife feel. No blue water fisherman could ever wake up on the Grand Banks and think he was off Georgia's, say, or Long Island. Cliffs of fog move in and smother the boats for weeks at a time. Winter cold fronts come howling down off the Canadian Shield and make the water smoke. The sea is so rich with plankton that it turns a dull green and swallows light rather than reflects it. Petrels and shearwaters circle the boats hundreds of miles from land. Great skuas swoop over the waters, rasping, "Ha ha ha!" at their empty world. Prehistoric-looking creatures called beak whales spook the crews of fog-bound boats. Killer whales range up and down the long lines, eating, strangely enough, only the pectoral fins of the blue sharks. Billy's fishing about 200 miles east of the tail, near the shallows known as Newfoundland's seamounts. On the horizon, he can occasionally make out the white pilot house of the boat called Mary T., captained by a Florida man named Albert Johnston. Johnston and Billy fish end for end about a week, setting their gear southwestward in two great parallel lines. The lines stitch back and forth across slight temperature breaks to anchor the gear in the slower-moving cold water. From time to time, they see each other during the haulback, but mostly they're just snowy images on each other's radar screens. Sword boats on the high seas don't socialize much. One would think they would. My God, all that emptiness. But generally, they rather socialize in a bathroom or in bed with their wives. A waterfront joke. What's the second thing a fisherman does when he gets home? Puts down his bags. Captains have been known to pull one steel bird out of the water on the trip home just because it slows them down by half a knot. Over the course of a week, that means 12 more hours until they get home. 4 or 5 days into October, Johnston hauls his last set and tells the rest of the fleet he's heading in. He says he'll radio the weather conditions back as soon as he goes. The boat rolls along atop an old decayed swell, and the crew catches up on their sleep and takes turns at the helm. A new moon rises behind them on October 7th, and they follow its pale suggestion all through the day until late that afternoon. The sunset is a bloody rust red on a sharp autumn horizon, and the night comes in as fast in fast with northwest wind and sky riveted with stars. There's no sound but the smack of water on steel and the heavy gargle of diesel engine. The Mary T makes port in Fairhaven, Massachusetts on October 12th, after more than a month at sea. Fairhaven is a smaller version of New Bedford, which sits half a mile across the Acushnet River. Both cities are tough, bankrupt little places that never managed to diversify during the century-long decline of the New England fishing industry. If Gloucester is the delinquent kid who's had a few scrapes with the law, New Bedford is truly mean older brother who's going to kill someone one day. One New Bedford bar was the scene of an infamous gang rape. Another was known to employ a Doberman Pinscher as a bouncer. A lot of heroin passes through New Bedford, and a lot of sword fishermen get in trouble there. One of Johnson's crew drew a $13,000 check in New Bedford and returned a week later without any shoes. Johnson ties up at Union Wharf alongside McLean's Seafood and North Atlantic Diesel. McLean's is battered two-story building with cement floors for draining fish blood and a rabbit warren of offices upstairs where deals are cut. Dark, wild-haired young men stomp around in rubber boots and shout to each other in Portuguese as they have fish around the room. With long knives, they loin the fish, carve the meat off the bones, and then seal it in vacuum bags and load it onto trucks. A good worker can loin a full-sized fish in 2 minutes. McLean's moved 2 million pounds of swordfish a year and 1 million pounds of tuna. They fly it overseas, ship it around the country, and sell it to the corner store. Johnson's boat takes most of a day to unload. The next day, he settles the accounts and starts fitting the boat out again. Food, diesel, water, ice, repairs, the usual. The faster the turnaround, the better not only will his crew be, more likely to survive New Bedford's charms, but it's getting late in the season to head out to the Grand Banks. The longer you wait, the worse the storms are. You get in that kind of weather, and if anything goes wrong, if a hitch busts off or one of the outriggers gets tangled up, you can really be in trouble, says Johnson. Some of the guys get to where they feel invincible, but they don't realize that there's a real fine line between what they've seen and what they can get, what it can get to. I know a guy who's lost a 900-foot boat out there. It broke in half and sank with 30 men. Sure enough, Johnson's still fitting out when the first ugly weather blows through. It's a double low that grinds off the coast and cranks the wind around to the southwest. The storm intensifies as it plows out to sea and catches Billy one morning while he's hauling back. The wind is 30 knots and the waves are washing over the deck, but they can't stop working until the gear is in. Late in the morning, they get slammed. It's a rogue wave. Steep, cresting, and maybe 30 feet high, it avalanches over the deck and buries the Andrea Gale under tons of water. One moment they're hauling station, tending the line. The next, they're way on their side. Heavily endlessly, the Andrea Gale rights herself, and Billy brings her around into the weather and checks for damages. The batteries have come out of the boxes down in the engine room, but that's about it. That evening, Billy radios Charlie Johnson of the Seneca to tell him what happened. Charlie's in Bay Bulls, Newfoundland, getting a crankshaft fixed, and Billy calls him every evening to keep him updated on the fleet. Jesus, we took a hell of a wave, Billy says. We went way over on our side. I didn't think we'd make it back up. They discuss the weather and the fishing for a few minutes, and then sign off. The story of the wave doesn't sound good to Charlie Johnson. The Andrea Gale's known for a tough little boat and shouldn't go over that easily. Not with a bird in the water and 20,000 pounds of fish in the hold. I didn't want to say anything, but it didn't seem right, Johnson says. You're in God's country out here. You can't make any mistakes. The Andrea Gale fishes east of the tail for another week and does very poorly. The trip's shaping up to be a total bust. A boat can't stay indefinitely out at sea. Supplies run low. The crew gets crazy. The fish get old. They've got to find some fish fast. Around mid-month, they pull their gear and steam northeast all night to a set of shallows known as the Flemish Cap. The rest of the fleet is way off to the south and west. Tommy Berry on the Allison, Charlie Johnson on the Seneca, Larry Horn on the Miss Millie, Mike Herbert on the Mr. Simon, and Linda Greenlaw on the Hannah Bowden. There's also a 150-foot Japanese longliner named the Aishin Maru 78. The Aishin Maru is carrying a Canadian fisheries observer, Judith Revis, who is the only person on board who has a survival suit or knows how to speak English. The Mary T is on her way out, and another boat named the Lorry Dawn 8 has just arrived in New Bedford to gear up. Billy's at 41 degrees west, way out on the edge. He's almost off the fishing charts. The weather has turned raw and blustery, and the men work in layers of sweatshirts and overalls and rubber slickers. It's the end of the season, their last chance for a decent trip. They just want to get this thing done. The Flemish Cap. And I saw, as it were, a sea of glass mingled with fire. Revelation 15. New Englanders started catching swordfish in the early 1800s by harpooning them from small sailboats and hauling them on board. Since swordfish don't school, the boats would go out with a man up the mast looking for single fins lolling about in the glassy inland waters. If the wind sprang up, the fins were undetectable, and the boats went in. When the lookout spotted a fish, he guided the captain over to it, and the harpooner made his throw. The throw had to take into account the roll of the boat, the darting of the fish, and the refraction of light through the water. Giant bluefin tuna are still hunted this way, but fishermen use spotter planes to find their prey and electric harpoons to kill them. Giant bluefin are a delicacy in Japan, and they are air freighted over and get up to $80 a pound. A single bluefin might go for $30,000 or $40,000. Spotter planes were introduced to New England fishermen in 1962, but it was the long line that really changed the fishery. For years, the Norwegians had caught mako on long lines, along with a few swordfish, but they had never gone after swordfish exclusively. Then, in 1961, Canadian fishermen made some alterations to the gear and nearly tripled the total northeastern sword catch. The boom didn't last long, though. 10 years later, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration determined that swordfish carried a dangerous amount of mercury in them, and both the American and Canadian governments banned the sale of the fish. Some longliners went out after swordfish anyway, but they risked having their catch seized and tested by the FDA. Finally, in 1978, the U.S. government relaxed the standards for acceptable mercury contamination in fish, and the gold rush was on. In the interim, fishing had changed, though. Boats were using satellite navigation, electronic fish finders, temperature depth gauges, radar reflectors were used to track gear, and new monofilament made it possible to set 30 or 40 miles of line at a time. By the mid-80s, the U.S. swordfish fleet alone was up to 700 boats fishing around 50 million hooks a year. The technological change appears to be bumping up against the limits of the resource, as one government study put it at the time. Until then, the fishery had been relatively unregulated, but a new drift entanglement net in the early 80s finally got the wheels of bureaucracy turning. The nets were a mile long, 90 feet wide, and set out all night from the stern of a converted longliner. Although the large mesh permitted juveniles to escape, the National Marine Fisheries Service was still leery of its impact on the swordfish population. They published a management plan for the North Atlantic swordfish that suggested numerous regulatory changes, including limiting the use of drift nets, and invited responses from state and federal agencies, as well as individual fishermen. A series of public hearings were held up and down the East Coast throughout 1983 and 1984, and fishermen who couldn't attend, those who were fishing, in other words, sent in letters. One of the people who responded was Bob Brown, who explained in a barely legible scrawl that he made 52 sets that year, and there seemed to be plenty of mature fish out there. They just stayed in colder water than people realized. Alex Bueno, of the Tiffany Vance, wrote a letter pointing out, among other things, that draggers weren't likely to switch over to drift nets because they cost too much, and that swordfish population estimates were inaccurate because they didn't take into account fish outside the 200-mile limit. Sports fishermen accused commercial fishermen of raping the oceans. Commercial fishermen accused sports fishermen of squandering a resource, and almost everyone accused the government of gross incompetence. In the end, the fishery management plan did not include a catch quota for Atlantic swordfish, but it required all sword boats to register with the National Marine Fisheries Service, a division of the Department of Commerce. Boat owners who never swordfished in their lives scrambled for permits just to keep their options open, and the number of boats nearly doubled while, by all indications, the swordfish stock continued to decline. From 1987 to 1991, the total North Atlantic swordfish catch went from 45 million pounds to 33 million pounds, and their average size dropped from 165 pounds to 110. This was what resource management experts know as tragedy of the commons, a reference to overgrazing in 18th century England. In the case of commons grazing areas, explained one fisheries management pamphlet, grass soon disappears as citizens put more sheep on the land. There was little incentive to conserve or invest the resource because others would then benefit without contributing. That was happening throughout the fishing industry. Haddock landings had plummeted to 1/15 of what they were in 1960. Cod landings had dropped by a factor of 4. The culprit, as it almost always has been in fishing, was sudden change in technology. New quick freeze techniques allowed boats to work halfway around the world and process their fish as they went, and this made the 3-mile limit around most countries completely ineffectual. Enormous Russian factory ships put to sea for months at a time and scoured the bottom with nets that could take 30 tons of fish in a single haul. They fished practically within sight of the American coast, and within years, the fish populations had been staggered by 50% losses. Congress had to take action, and in 1976 they passed the Magnuson Fishery Conservation and Management Act, which extended our national sovereignty 200 miles offshore. Most other nations quickly followed suit. Of course, the underlying concern wasn't for fishing populations, it was for the American fleet. Having chased out the competition, America set about constructing an industry that could scrape the Georgia's bank just as bare as any Russian factory ship. After the passage of the Magnuson Act, American fishermen could take out federally guaranteed loans and set themselves up for business in $250,000 steel boats. To make matters worse, the government established 8 regional fishing councils that were exempt from conflict of interest laws. In theory, this should have put fisheries management into the hands of the people who fished. In reality, it showed the fox into the chicken coop. Within 3 years of Magnuson, the New England fleet had doubled to 1,300 boats. Better equipment resulted in such huge takes that prices dropped and fishermen had to resort to more and more devastating methods just to keep up. Draggers raked the bottom so hard they actually leveled outcrops and filled in valleys, the very habitats where fish thrived. A couple of good years in the mid-'80s masked the overall decline, but the end was near, and many people knew it. The first time anyone, at least any fisherman, suggested a closure was in 1988, when a Chatham fisherman named Mark Simonich stood up to speak at a New England Fisheries Council meeting. Simonich had fished off Cape Cod his whole life. His brother James was a marine safety consultant who had worked for Bob Brown. Both men knew fishermen, knew fish, and knew where things were headed. Simonich suggested that Georgia's Bank be closed to all fishing indefinitely. He was shouted down, but it was the beginning of the end. The swordfish population didn't crash as fast as some others, but it crashed all the same. By 1988, the combined North Atlantic fleet was fishing over 100 million hooks a year, and catch logs were showing that the swordfish population was getting younger and younger. Finally, in 1990, the International Commission for the Conservation of Tunas suggested a fishing quota for the North Atlantic swordfish. The following year, the National Marine Fishery Service implemented a quota of 6.9 million pounds of dressed swordfish in the U.S. licensed sword boats, roughly two-thirds of the previous year's catch. Every U.S. licensed boat had to report their catch when they arrived back in port. And as soon as the overall quota was met, the entire fishery was shut down. In a good year, the quota might be met in September. In bad years, it might not be met at all. The result was that not only were fishing boats now racing the season, they were racing each other. When the Andrea Gale left port on September 23rd, she was working under a quota for the first time in her life. Albert Johnston has the Mary T back out on the fishing grounds by October 17th, and his gear in the water that night. He's 100 miles south of the tail, right on the edge of the Gulf Stream, around 41 north and 51 west. He's after big eye tuna, and doing really well. Mugging 'em, as swordfishermen say. One night, they lose $20,000 worth of big eye to a pod of killer whales, but otherwise they're pulling in 4,000 or 5,000 pounds of fish a night. That's easily enough to make a trip in 10 sets. They're in the warm Gulf Stream water, and the rest of the fleet's off to the east. At that time of the year, it's nice to fish down by the Gulf, Johnson says. You get a little less bad weather. The lows tend to ride in jet stream off to the north. You could still get the worst storm there ever was, but the average weather's a little better. Like most of the other captains out there, Johnston started commercial fishing before he could dive. He was running a boat by age 19 and bought his first one at 29. Now, at 36, he has a wife and 2 children and a small business back in Florida. He sells fishing tackle to commercial boats. There comes a point in every boat owner's life, after the struggles of his 20s, the terror of the initial investment, when he realizes that he can relax a bit. He doesn't need to take late-season trips to the banks, doesn't need to captain the boat month in and month out. At 36, it's time to start letting the younger guys in. Guys who have little more than a girlfriend in Pompano Beach, and a pile of mail at the crow's nest. Of course, there's also the question of odds. The more you get out, the more likely you are to never come back. The dangers are numerous and random. The rogue wave that wipes you off the deck, the hook and leader that catches your palm, the tanker that plots a course through the center of your boat. The only way to guard against these dangers is to stop rolling the dice, and the man with a family and business back home is more likely to do that. More people are killed on the fishing boats per capita than any other job in the United States. Johnston would be better off parachuting into forest fires or working as a cop in New York City than longlining off the Flemish Cap. Johnston knows many fishermen who have died, and more than he can count, who have come horribly close. It's there waiting for you in the middle of a storm, or on the most cloudless summer day. Boom, the crew's looking the other way. The hook's got you, and suddenly you're down at the depth where swordfish feed. Back in 1983, a friend of Johnston's ran into a fall gale in an 87-foot boat called the Canyon Explorer. 3 lows merged off the coast and formed one massive storm that blew 100 knots for a day and a half. The seas were so big that Johnston's friend had to goose the throttle just to keep from sliding backward down their faces. The boat was forced 60 miles backward, despite driving full steam ahead, because the whole surface of the ocean had been set in motion. At one point, the captain glanced out the window and saw an enormous wave coming at them. "Hey, Charlie, look at this," he shouted to another crew member who was down below. Charlie sprinted up the companionway, but didn't get to the wheelhouse in time. The wave bore down on them, slate-colored and foaming, and blew the wheelhouse windows out. That happened to be a particularly severe storm, and it devastated the rest of the fleet. A boat named the Lady Alice had her wheelhouse knocked in, and a crew member paralyzed for life. The Tiffany Vance, which had just transferred fisheries observer Joseph Pelzarski to the Andrea Gale the week before, nearly went down with her sister ship, the Rush. The two boats were a mile apart when the storm hit, way out on the Flemish Cap, and both lost their port side stabilizing birds. The bird on the Tiffany Vance was hung from the chain, and without 200 pounds of steel to keep it down, the chain started slamming against the boat. It had to be cut. Alex Bueno, the captain, stripped to his underwear, tied a rope around his waist, and waded out onto the deck with a welding torch. There was so much water coming over the deck that he had trouble keeping the torch lit. He finally managed to burn the chain free, and then he went back inside and waited for the boat to sink. "We didn't even bother calling the Coast Guard. We were just too far out," he says. "There's really nothing to do but rely on the other guys around you." Unfortunately, the Rush was in even more trouble than the Tiffany Vance. She had a cable on her birds instead of chains, and the broken cable managed to wrap itself around the drive shaft and freeze the propeller. The boat went dead in the water, and immediately turned side to in the waves. In a beam sea, it's called. A boat in a beam sea can count her future in hours, maybe minutes. Wayne Rushmore, her captain, got on the radio and told Bueno he was going down and needed help. But Bueno radioed back that he was going down too. The Rush's crew went back out on deck, and taking extraordinary risks, managed to pull the cable free of the propeller. For the next several days, the two boats rode the storm out side by side. At one point, the sun came out, and Bueno noticed that the larger waves put his wheelhouse in shadow. They blocked out the sun. By all reports, Billy's having a terrible trip. After 14 sets, he has only about 20,000 pounds of fish in the hold, which is barely enough to cover expenses, much less compensate 6 men for a month of their life. When Linda Greenlaw arrives on the fishing grounds, Billy tells her that he's disgusted and is going to need more fuel if they want to make any money at all. Sword boats lend each other supplies all the time on the high seas, but Billy has a particular reputation for pushing things to the limit. This is not the first time Linda has bailed him out. The two boats rendezvous south of the Flemish Cap, and Linda drops a tow line and refueling hose over the side. Billy comes up bow to stern and ties off the tow line, and the boats chug along, the Hannah Bowden pulling the Andrea Gale. While the fuel gets pumped into Billy's tanks, it's a dangerous maneuver with any other boat. Bob Brown would insist that Linda just tie floats to fuel drums and drop them over the side, but sister ships are a different matter. They'll do almost anything to give themselves an edge over the rest of the fleet. When they're finished, Linda hauls her lines back, and the two crews wave goodbye as the boats draw apart. Half an hour later, they're just white squares on each other's radar screens. The fuel is just the beginning of Billy's problems, though. Throughout the trip, he's been having trouble getting the ice machine to work properly. Ordinarily, it's supposed to pump out 3 tons of ice a day, but the compensator is malfunctioning and cannot even handle half that. Day by day, in other words, the quality of the fish is starting to drop. A loss of just 50 cents per pound would mean $20,000 off the value of the catch. That could only be offset by catching more fish, which in turn means staying out even longer. It's a classic cost-benefit dilemma that fishermen have agonized over for centuries. And then there's the crew. They get ugly at about the same rate as badly iced fish. By the end of the long trip, they may be picking fights with one another, hoarding food, ostracizing the new members, acting in short like men in prison, which in some ways they are. There are stories of sword boats coming into port with crew members manacled to their bunks or tied to the headstay with monofilament line. It's a kind of Darwinism that keeps the boat stocked with rough, belligerent men who have already established themselves in the hierarchy. Billy would never permit that sort of viciousness on his boat. The crew are all friends, more or less, and he intends to keep it that way. But he knows you can lock 6 men together for only so long before someone gets crazy. They've been at sea 3 weeks and are looking at a minimum of 2 more. If they're going to salvage anything from the trip, they've got to catch some fish in a hurry. Billy keeps talking with the other captains, studying surface temperature charts, analyzing the water column with his Doppler. He's looking for that temperature, discontinuity, that concentration of plankton, mackerel, and squid. In 5 good sets, they could turn this trip around. He knows it. Ice or no ice, he's not going back until they do. Billy Tyne has the only private room on the Andrea Gale, which is standard for the captain. On some boats, the captain's quarters are upstairs behind the bridge, but Billy's is in a small room next to the head. It's about the size of a private sleeper on an Amtrak train. There's a sea bag full of dirty clothes and a few photos taped to the wall. The photos are of his 2 daughters, Erica and Billy Joe. 7 years ago, when Billy Joe was born, Billy stayed home to take care of her a while his wife worked. Billy Joe got used to having a father around and took it hard when he went back to the boat. Erica was born 4 years later and has never known anything different. As far as she's concerned, fathers are men who go away for weeks at a time and come home smelling of fish. The rest of the crew are wedged into a dark little room across from the galley. The bunks are stacked along the inner wall and the starboard hull, and the floor is covered with the detritus that accumulates around the young men. Clothes, cassette tapes, beer cans, cigarettes, magazines. Along with the magazines are dozens of books, including a few ragged paperbacks by Dick Francis. Francis writes about horse racing, which seems to appeal to sword fishermen, because it's another way to win or lose huge amounts of money. The books get passed around the fleet at about 400 miles an hour. As one sword fisherman put it, and they've probably been to the Grand Banks more times than the men themselves. Most fishermen tape photos of their girlfriends to the wall alongside the pages ripped from Penthouse and Playboy, and the crew of the Andrea Gale are undoubtedly no different. The galley is the largest room on the boat, other than the first hold. At first glance, it could almost be a kitchen in a house trailer. Wood veneer, fluorescent panel lights, cheap woods cabinets. There's a 4-burner gas stove and an industrial stainless steel refrigerator, and a Formica table angled into the forward wall. A bench runs along the length of the port side, and there's a single porthole above the bench. It's too small for a man to wiggle out of. A door at the aft of the galley exits into a small holding area and the companionway that goes down into the engine room. The companionway is protected by a watertight door that screws down securely with 4 steel dogs. The forecastle and pilot house doors are watertight as well. In theory, the entire forward end of the boat can be sealed off with the crew inside. The engine, an 8-cylinder, 365 horsepower turbocharged diesel, is slightly more powerful than the largest tractor-trailer rigs on the highway. The engine was refurbished in 1989 because the boat flooded at dock after a discharge pipe froze, cracking the weld. The engine drives a propeller shaft that runs through a cutout in the aft bulkhead of the compartment and through the fish hold to the stern of the boat. Most boats have a gasket that seals the prop as it passes through the bulkhead, but the Andrea Gale does not. This is a weak point. Flooding in the fish hold could conceivably slosh forward and kill the engine, crippling the boat. The machinery room sits just forward of the engine and is crammed with tools, spare parts, lumber, old clothes, a backup generator, and 3 bilge pumps. The job of the pumps is to lift water out of the hold faster than it comes in. In the old days, crews would be at the hand pumps for days at a stretch, and ships went down when storms outlasted the men. The tools are stored in metal lockboxes on the floor and include just about everything you'd need to rebuild the engine. Vice grips, pry bar, hammer, crescent wrenches, pipe wrenches, socket wrenches, Allen wrenches, files, hacksaws, channel lock pliers, bolt cutters, ball peen hammer, spare parts, and are packed in cardboard boxes and stacked on wooden shelves. Starter motor, cooling pump, alternator, hydraulic hose and fittings, V-belts, jumper wires, fuses, hose clamps, gasket material, nuts and bolts, sheet metal, silicone rubber, plywood, screw gun, duct tape, lube oil, hydraulic oil, transmission oil, and fuel fitters. Boats try at all costs to avoid going into Newfoundland for repairs. Not only does it waste valuable time, but it costs obscene amounts of money. One infamous repair bill amounted to $50,000 for what should have been a $3,500 job. The machinists had reportedly run their latches at 46 RPMs rather than 400 in order to rack up overtime. As a result, swordboat captains help each other out on the high seas whenever they can. They lend engine parts, offer technical advice, donate food or fuel. The competition between a dozen boats rushing a perishable commodity to market fortunately doesn't kill an inherent sense of concern for each other. This may seem terrifically noble, but it's not, or at least not entirely. It's also self-interested. Each captain knows he may be the next one with the frozen injector or the leaking hydraulics. Diesel fuel on the Andrea Gale is carried in a pair of 2,000-gallon tanks along either side of the engine room, and in two 1,750-gallon tanks at the stern. There are also 30 plastic drums lashed to a whaleback with another 1,650 gallons of fuel. Each one has AG painted on them in white lettering. 2,000 gallons of fresh water are stored in two four-peak tanks, and another 500 gallons or so are stored in drums up on deck, along with the oil. There's also a water maker that purifies salt water by forcing it through a membrane at 800 pounds per square inch. The membrane is so fine that it even filters out bacteria and viruses. The boat butcher, who is constantly covered in fish guts, gets to shower every day. The rest of the crew showers every 2 or 3. The fish hold is gained by a single steel ladder that drops steeply down from a hatch in the middle of the deck. During storms, the hatch is covered and lashed down so that big seas can't pry it off, although they still manage to. The hold is divided by plywood pen boards that keep the load from shifting. A shifted load can put a boat over on her side and keep her there until she sinks. There's an industrial freezer in the stern where the food is stored, and then another compartment called the lazarette. The lazarette is where the steering mechanism is housed. Like the engine room, it's not sealed off from the rest of the boat. Up on deck, immediately forward of the fish hold, is the tool room. 6-liter carts, spools as big as car tires, are lined up behind the staircase that rises to the whaleback deck. The men hang their foul weather gear along the wall behind the spools, along with anything else that could get swept away on deck. An overhang in the whaleback protects the Lindgren longline reel, and the portside bulwark has been raised to the height of the whaleback and extended 18 feet aft. Huddled up against it are bins full of ball drops, high flyers, radio beacons, everything that hangs off of a long line. At the stern of the boat is the setting out house, a frame and plywood shed that gives some shelter to the men when they're baiting the line. A big sea across the stern might take out the setting out house. Otherwise, it would probably be protected by the pilot house up front. The deck is steel and covered with no skid tiles. The gunnels are waist high and have gaps in them, called scuppers, or freeing ports, that allow boarding seas to drain off deck. The scuppers are normally blocked by scupper plates that prevent fish and gear from sliding out to sea, but when the weather gets dangerous, the plates are taken out, or should be. The ability of a boat to clear her decks is one of the most crucial aspects of her design. A boarding sea is like putting a swimming pool on deck. The boat wallows, loses her steerage, and for a few minutes is in extreme danger. One longline fisherman, a Gloucester local named Chris, was almost lost in such a situation. The boat he was on was running down sea when she took one wicked sea from hell. The stern lifted, the bow dropped, and they started surfing down the face of the wave. When they got to the bottom, there was nowhere to go but down, and the rest of the crew of the breaking wave drove them like a piling. Chris looked out the porthole, and all he could see was black. If you look out the porthole and see white water, you're still near the surface and relatively safe. If you see green water, at least you're in the body of the wave. If you see black water, you're a submarine. I felt the boat come to a complete stop, says Chris. I thought, my God, we're going down. We hung there a moment, and then the buoyancy caught up, and it was as if she'd been thrown into reverse. We plowed right back out the way we came. Any number of things could have happened to Chris's boat at that moment. The breather pipes could have gotten stuffed and killed the engine. The fish hatch could have given way and filled the hold. A tool could have gotten loose and knocked out some machinery. The wheelhouse windows could have exploded, a bulkhead could have failed, or 30 tons of ice and fish could have shifted in the hold. But assuming the boat popped up like a cork, she would still be laboring under a crushing load of water. If anything were caught in the scuppers, a hatch cover, or an old sleeping bag, the water could have been impeded as it drained off. All it takes is a moment of vulnerability for the next wave to roll you over. Props in the air, crew on their ass, cargo avalanching, it's the end. Every boat has a degree of roll from which she can no longer recover. The Queen Mary came within a degree or two of capsizing off Newfoundland when a rogue wave burst her pilot-house windows 90 feet up. She sagged on her beam ends for an agonizing minute before regaining her trim. Two forces are locked in combat for a ship like that: the downward push of gravity and the upward lift of buoyancy. Gravity is the combined weight of the vessel and everything on it: crew, cargo, fishing gear, seeking the center of the earth. Buoyancy is the force of all the enclosed air in the hull trying to raise above the water level. On a trim and stable ship, these two forces are equal and cancel each other out along the center line. But all this changes when the boat gets shoved over onto her side. Instead of being lined up, the two forces are now laterally offset. The center of gravity stays where it is, but the center of buoyancy migrates to the submerged side, where proportionally more air has been forced below waterline. With gravity pushing down at the center and buoyancy pushing up from the submerged side, the ship pivots on her center and returns to an even keel. The more ship heels, the farther apart the two forces act, and the more leverage the center of buoyancy has. To greatly simplify, the lateral distance between the two forces is called the rightening arm, and the torque they generate is called the rightening moment. Boats want a big rightening moment. They want something that will right them from the extreme angles of heel. The rightening moment has three main implications. First of all, the wider the ship, the more stable she is. More air is submerged as she heels over, so the righting arm is that much longer. The opposite is also true. The taller the ship, the more likely she is to capsize. The high center of gravity reduces what is called the metacentric height, which determines the length of the rightening arm. The greater the metacentric height, the less leverage there is with which to overcome the downward force of gravity. Finally, there always comes a point where the boat can no longer right herself. Logically, this would happen when her decks have gone past vertical and the center of gravity falls outside of the center of buoyancy, the zero moment point. But in reality, boats get into trouble a lot sooner than that. Depending on the design, an angle of about 60 or 70 degrees starts to put a vessel's lee gunwales underwater. That means the green water on deck and the rightening moment has that much more weight to overcome. The boat may eventually recover, but she's spending more and more time underwater. The deck is subject to the full fury of the waves, and a hatch might come loose, a bulkhead might fail, a door might bust open, because someone forgot to dog it down. Now she's not sailing, she's sinking. The problem with a steel boat is that the crisis curve starts out gradually and quickly becomes exponential. The more trouble she's in, the more trouble she's likely to get in, and the less capable she is of getting out of it, which is an acceleration of a catastrophe that is almost impossible to reverse. With the boat's bilge partially flooded, she sits lower in the water and takes more and more prolonged rolls. Longer rolls means less steerage. Lower buoyancy means more damage. If there's enough damage, flooding may overwhelm the pumps and short out the engine or gag its air intakes. With the engine gone, the boat has no steerage at all and turns broadside to the seas. Broadside exposes her to the full force of breaking waves, and eventually, a part of her deck or wheelhouse lets go. After that, downflooding starts to occur. Downflooding is the catastrophic influx of ocean water into the hold. It's a sort of death rattle at sea, the nearly vertical last leg of an exponential curve. In Portland, Maine, the Coast Guard Office of Marine Safety has a video clip of a fishing boat downflooding off the coast of Nova Scotia. The boat was rammed amidship by another boat in the fog, and the video starts with a ramming boat backing full screw astern. It's all over in 20 seconds. The crippled vessel settles in her stern, rears bow up, and then sinks. She goes down so fast that it looks as if she's getting yanked under by some huge hand. The last few moments of the film show the crew diving off the upended bow and trying to swim to the other boat 50 feet away. Half of them make it. Half of them don't. They're sucked down by the vacuum of a large steel boat making for the deep. Very few boats ever get to that point, of course. They might take water in the hold or lose their antennas or windows, but that's it. The result, fortunately, is that their stability limits are rarely tested in a real-life situation. The only way to know the stability profile for each boat is to perform a standard dockside test on her. A 5,000-pound weight is put on deck, 10 feet off the center line, and the resulting angle of heel is run through a standard formula that gives the righting moment. So many things can affect the stability of the boat, though, that even the Coast Guard considers these tests to be of limited value. Load a few tons of gear onto the deck, take a little water in her bilge, shift from long lining to dragging to gill netting, and the dynamics of the ship change completely. As a result, stability tests are mandatory only for vessels over 79 feet. At deck height, the Andrea Gale measures 72. When the Andrea Gale was overhauled in 1986, Bob Brown simply pulled her out of the water and started welding. No stability tests were performed. No marine architect was consulted. In the trade, this is known as eyeball engineering, and it includes the Andrea Gale in an overwhelming majority of the commercial fleet that has been altered without plans. The work was done in St. Augustine trawlers in St. Augustine, Florida. In all, 8 tons of machinery and structural changes were added to the boat, including the fuel and water drums on her whaleback deck. After the work was finished, marine surveyor James Simonich, whose brother Mark would propose shutting down Georgia's Bank the following year, flew to Florida to re-inspect the Andrea Gale. 2 years earlier, he had appraised both the Hannah Bowden and Andrea Gale for the settlement of Bob Brown's divorce, and the Andrea Gale had been valued at $400,000. Simonich surveyed her again in January 1987 and wrote a letter to Bob Brown with some minor suggestions. Loosen the dogs on one of the watertight doors and provide flotation collars and lights for the survival suits. Otherwise, the vessel seemed shipshape. The modifications and additional furnishings will increase the vessel's ability to make longer trips and return with higher quality product. Simonich concluded. The question of stability never came up. In 1990, the St. Augustine shipyards was sold by the International Revenue Service for non-payment of taxes. In October of that year, Simonitch visited the Andrea Gale in Gloucester and made a few suggestions: professionally service the 6-man life raft, replace a dead battery in the Class B EPIRB, and install a flare kit in the wheelhouse. Again, there was no mention of the stability tests, but the vessel was well within the law. Bob Brown also neglected to refile documentation for the Andrea Gale after altering her hull, although neither discrepancy was Simonitch's problem. He was paid to look at a boat and evaluate what he saw. In November 1990, the principal surveyor for the Marine Safety Consultants, Inc., the company that employed Simonitch, inspected the Andrea Gale one last time. The vessel was well suited for its purpose, he wrote. Submitted without prejudice, David C. Dubois. If Billy Tyne were inclined to worry, though, there were a number of things about the Andrea Gale that might have given him pause. First of all, according to Tommy Berry of the Allison, she had a boxy construction and a forward wheelhouse that took the seas hard. She was a rugged boat that didn't concede much to the elements. And then there were the St. Augustine alterations. The extended whaleback deck was burdened with the weight of an ice maker and 3 dozen 55-gallon drums, so her center of gravity had been raised and she would recover from rolls a little more slowly. Only a couple of other boats in the fleet, the Eagle Eye, the Seahawk, store oil on their upper decks. The portside bulwark on the Andrea Gale could be a problem too. It had been raised and extended